Hey, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of the Speak Plainly podcast, where we speak plainly about things that matter. I'm your host, Owl Medicine, and in today's podcast, we're going to be talking about proximal abandonment. What exactly is proximal abandonment, and why does it matter? Since we're talking about it on a podcast of things that matter, and it matters a lot. I wrote an article up on owlchrysalismedicine.com called Proximal Abandonment, the Modern Mental Health Dilemma, and it has gotten way more reads than most other of my fairly recent articles. So it's a very important concept to me that I think people really need to pay attention to, people who are on a healing path of any sort, because it's unfortunate how pervasive it is, and it's not evil or anything like that, but damn is it pervasive and damn is it damaging. So we're going to talk about proximal abandonment. We're going to talk about what proximal abandonment is versus regular abandonment, what we think of anyway as regular abandonment, if you want to call it regular. That's some weird connotations, but whatever. We're going to talk about how it's kind of created by modern society, especially with our kind of working from home everything now since COVID. We're going to talk about 7 of the signs of abandonment trauma. And then we're going to go even a little bit deeper into what kind of compulsive behaviors result because of abandonment trauma. And of course, at the end of it all, we're going to talk a little bit about what can we do about it? What can we do as individuals now to help us figure out and get through our abandonment trauma so we can live happy and fulfilled lives. So, let's get started. Proximal abandonment is different from regular abandonment because when we think of abandonment, we think often of like leaving a child in a hot car, or like leaving a baby on the doorstep of a church, or like leaving a child at home for days on end or something. These kind of more gross as in like, gross as in like disgusting or whatever, but mostly gross as in like these larger, more obvious forms of abandonment. But in my work with trauma, I have realized that the overwhelming majority of the trauma that people suffer from that deeply impacts their lives aren't extreme forms of trauma. They manifest extremely in some of us, but the trauma itself, like the stressful event, I should say, the stressful event itself that caused the trauma isn't as nearly as bad as we think it ought to be in order for us to have the fears that we have. Does that make sense? Like, often we look back at like, oh, well, mom said this or didn't say that, and it affected me this way, but that seems like ridiculous. Like, why? Like, I'm being dramatic. And I think a lot of that comes from this proximal abandonment issue. So it's not leaving a child in a hot car. So what is it? It's being in the same room and still not being with your child. Right. And it's not just a mother and child thing, but that's what we're going to focus on today, because that's kind of what's happening ever since like Gen X was being raised and parents were like, we had more 2-parent households. And ever since we had more 2-parent households and we have like latchkey kids where the parents were gone and the kids would go home from school and let themselves in the locked door and turn on their like alarm system and microwave something out of the freezer, and they took care of themselves, right? Like, these children, I'm talking very loosely about Gen X here, kind of. These children had their physical needs met, right? Like, they had food, they had shelter, they had clothes, but they're pretty fucked up. And the reason they're pretty fucked up is, to me, proximal abandonment. So what that means is, like, how do we get proximal abandonment? If you're sitting next to your child and your child is like tugging on your jacket and being like, mommy, 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 daddy, 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 and you're constantly like ignoring them and being like, mommy has to work, daddy has to work, that causes proximal abandonment. Mommy and daddy have to work, right? Like, that's not a thing that we can get around. And that's why this is not like, it's not a blame the parent kind of scenario again, but it's very important to be considered, because this is very much a modern issue to me. This is very much a 21st century issue, because we have never had so many things vying for our attention while we have been rearing children. Never in our history as a species have we had so many things vying for our attention. And in the modern world, you kind of have to shuffle so many things, juggle so many things all at one time, that it becomes very hard to be able to give the very, very focused attention that a child needs in order to attain attunement. So proximal abandonment is this idea of dad working from home or mom working from home and being there and providing a child with the physiological needs. They have food and water and shelter and love, right? But they don't have anybody paying attention to what their emotional reality is. This happens because parents are not allowed to attend to their own emotional reality, because they are trying to attend to the reality of the world around them and paying bills and all of that sort of thing. So society, post-capitalism, all of this stuff are adding to this proximal abandonment, modern mental health dilemma. And this is why so many people now are fairly antisocial. It's why so many people they consider themselves to be ADHD trauma babies, but also maybe don't, like not full time anyway, because the majority of people, I believe, I hang out with a lot of really traumatized folks because like attracts like, but there's a lot of folks I hang out with, especially once I've started working through and dealing with my own trauma and handling it all much better. I found myself getting much closer to people who had trauma, but they kind of didn't recognize it. They see it as trauma because their parents loved them. Their parents appreciated them, and all of that's true. But that doesn't mean that there aren't lingering echoes of these things like proximal abandonment happening in their life. They're just harder to see because as adults, we look at our parents and we're like, they did their best. And they did. And they were there, but not all the time, because no one can be. Right? So it's not a blame the parents kind of situation. It's the reality of the world now today is it's very hard to have enough time and energy to be able to accurately and consistently attune to the emotional needs of your child. That is what causes proximal abandonment, because what's happening is the parent is in the room or in the house and still completely absent, or absent more often than would be beneficial, right? They're not here when they're needed emotionally. Right, so this brings up some arguments about what is the job of a parent? Well, how do you measure the success of a parent? And I've said in the past that so long as they make it to 18 alive, that's a level of success. If they make it to 40 and they like you somewhere around 40, fuck 20 to 40 or whatever, but if they make it to if they make it to 40 and they actually like you, I think you did a pretty good job. There is no successful, perfectly successful parenting issue or parenting thing, because it's an impossible job, period, full stop. But proximal abandonment is the kind of abandonment that most people wind up with, which is why we have abandonment issues. And we're going to get to 7 signs of these abandonment issues. But what I really want to drive home is the fact that these abandonment issues that we're about to go over, these 7, and then the compulsive behaviors that happen as a result because of these abandonment issues, are not necessarily coming from what we would call gross neglect. It's not gross neglect and abandonment. These things genuinely come from parents who did their best and did pretty good. I feel like a parent can do pretty darn good and still wind up with their children having these issues. So I'm saying that to any parents who are listening who are like feeling extra judged or whatever. That's not what this is about. This is about bringing awareness to the fact that you can be in the room and meeting the physical needs of your child and them still not have what they need and leave the situation traumatized. Now, we can, on another podcast, maybe talk about like the skills that need to be learned and the boundaries and the ways to pivot from one thing to another and ways to talk to a child and that to make them feel seen and that sort of thing. But that's a whole nother thing. Let's get into how you might know if you struggled with proximal abandonment, because again, most of these issues, like, you're going to see manifest in at a certain scale according to what the scale of your trauma or what the scale of your abandonment was. Some will be worse. You might show some of these 7 signs. You might show all of them, and some of them you might show more than others, just according to what your unique trauma and abandonment situation was and your own unique build and personality. But proximal abandonment, really, it manifests in these 7 signs. Really, any kind of abandonment does. Proximal abandonment is just really, really sneaky because we wind up with these trauma signs while believing that we don't actually have any trauma because our parents were good parents and they loved us and they tried really hard. But somehow we have all of these issues, and so then we blame ourselves. And again, this is why I wrote Rethinking Broken. It's not your fault, so don't blame yourself. And especially with proximal abandonment, it's probably not your parents' fault either. It just is what it is, and now we got to figure out what we're going to do about it. And we'll talk about what we're going to do about it at the very, very end. So, 7 signs of abandonment trauma. Number 1, people-pleasing. Are you a people pleaser? Are you constantly obsessed with helping other people achieve what it is that they want and making sure that other people are happy? Now, there's a positive side to all of these, right? All of these 7 that we're going to go through, some of it is adaptive in some way. The problem is it becomes maladaptive, and this is why it's the 7 signs of abandonment trauma. People pleasing to a maladaptive or not helpful level. If you find that you are a people pleaser to a level that it becomes a problem for you, that you can't say no, you might have some abandonment issues. And if you are like, well, my parents did really well, then those issues are probably proximal abandonment issues. Maybe your abandonment wasn't proximal and it was terrible and it was obvious. And if that's the case, you'll probably still have people-pleasing qualities. Number 2, you struggle with insecurity. This is so true for all of us. And like, it's so easy to figure out where this comes from if you just run yourself through a little scenario of what proximal abandonment is like. You can use that, like, sitting even at dinner while mom is on the laptop and the kid's in the high chair, should be getting little airplanes of food or whatever, but mom's clacking away on the keyboard trying to keep bills paid and keep the lights on, keep food in the house, right? And that, if you are constantly trying to reach out for attention, even at dinner, but mom is working, or what that does is you're reaching out saying, hey, I have this need, hey, I have this need, hey, I have this need, and then that need is not being met. So then you go, oh, well, I guess I'm not supposed to have this need because needs ought to be met. Like anything that I want, if I'm a good little boy, good little girl, I'll get that thing. And if I don't, I apparently don't deserve that thing. And obviously these are very basic thoughts coming from basically a theta state, which is like, it's not even a conscious state in children. The children are staying in a theta state primarily between the ages of 2 and 7. Some say 3 and 7. But all of these things are kind of just, the theta state is, the delta and theta are what they use in hypnosis. So your child is basically hypnotized the entire time. So whatever impressions that we give them through our actions are what they're going to leave with. So if we are reaching out for an emotional need and that emotional need is not getting met, then we become insecure about our needs. We become insecure that the things that we need mean that we're not going to get them from the place that we want them from, the place that we need them from. And if we push, we're going to be abandoned, because no matter how many times that we ask, we didn't get it. And if you keep asking and going, mom, 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 eventually they're going to blow up and be like, what? What do you want? And then you go, oh. And you might ask and you might not. But you leave with these feelings of insecurity. Sign number 3 is that you find it really hard to trust people. And this comes out in lots of ways. You might not trust a stranger. You find the entire world a threat. If you have children, you're probably telling your children not to do this and not to do that, because this, and this will happen, and then that will mean that you die. It's hard to trust people. So you also find yourself very jealous in relationships, which is not very fun. We don't believe the promises that other people make when we don't trust people. Like, we assume that nobody is going to be there when we really, really need them. If this sounds like you might have abandonment trauma. If you don't think that your parents were bad parents, then you might have proximal abandonment trauma. Sign number 4 is you're afraid of vulnerability. This, like, you're uncomfortable with vulnerability. You're uncomfortable with honesty. If there was a relationship in which somebody is asking you about your needs, or asking you about your feelings, asking you about your authentic reality in that moment, that can be terrifying, because we're afraid of vulnerability because of the trauma of abandonment. We are afraid that somebody is going to abandon us, and they are what's supposed to help us meet our needs, at least as children. So we become afraid of losing them. So we become afraid of being vulnerable towards anybody, because then we're kind of screwed, right? If we're vulnerable and somebody else doesn't meet our needs, then we're fucked. So we learn to not be vulnerable. It's a much safer bet. That's number 4. Number 5 is we're looking for reasons to leave, especially in romantic relationships and jobs, whatever. We're looking for reasons to leave. If you are the type of person that has a list of deal breakers, you're like, this is a deal breaker, this is a deal breaker, this is a deal breaker, this is a deal breaker. I mean, some of those good non-negotiables, we've talked about those, especially for people with trauma. But if you have a long list of deal breakers, or if somebody does something that pisses you off and then suddenly that thing becomes a deal breaker, you probably have abandonment problems, abandonment trauma. You're always looking for a reason to leave. You focus on the flaws of the people around you. You focus on the flaws of your partner, and nothing that they do is ever good enough. And you always feel like everybody is bound to disappoint you. Everybody's going to disappoint you. So why even bother? Why even try? And you assume that nobody's going to meet your expectations. Like, so you leave. Like, if you can't meet these expectations, if you don't meet this, and this, bye. I mean, some of that seems cool, right? Because there's a type of trauma that makes it to where we will stay in terrible situations for a really long time. But people with this, like, more on this bent, see that as an extreme version of weakness. And this is the extreme version that's supposed to be a counterpoint that somehow shows strength, but is actually a sign of our own weakness. This is sign number 5 of abandonment trauma. We are always looking for reasons to leave, because if we leave them, then they can't leave us, right? Number 6, I love this one. You move on too quickly. If whenever you recognize that something goes wrong, your immediate thought is to bounce to the next exciting thing, you have abandonment trauma. It may be proximal, it may be like regular, but you have abandonment trauma. That's most likely, right? Anyway, it's very likely. I guess I can't say that 100%, but you probably have abandonment trauma if you move on too quickly. Because what's happening is you're cycling through your relationships. And every time you cycle through the relationships and you leave and then you throw yourself into the next exciting thing, what you're doing is you're ignoring your own emotional fallout. There are emotional repercussions to literally every single thing that you do, period. Whether even you care about it or not, because we tend to like to do things well, and there's all of these frameworks and judgments about everything in our existence. That's how we navigate the world. We always care. So we're trying to avoid the emotional fallout by throwing ourselves into the next most interesting thing. Instead of sitting with what it feels like that we broke up with somebody or they broke up with us, we just move on to the next thing. Maybe it's the next dude to get under. Maybe it's the next dick to get on. Maybe it's the next job. Maybe it's a new song. Maybe it's something else. But if you're immediately going from one thing to the next, to the next, to the next, with no time in between to pause and reflect, you probably have abandonment trauma. This is really, really, really true. Please pay attention to this. It's a very, very real one. You're always off to do something new and exciting, and you're chasing that dopamine train, all because you have repressed negative emotional realities that you refuse to deal with. And the reason you refuse to deal with them is because you don't have the skills to deal with them. But we'll get to that in a little bit when we talk about the compulsive behaviors. Because all of these 7 signs, they often lead to compulsive behaviors in us, either immediately or secondarily and down the line. So the last of these 7 that I'm going to talk about today are you have cycles of unhealthy relationships. Whether it's still or whether it's a thing that you started off especially early on because of the trauma that we experience as a child. If we have abandonment trauma, the whole thing that we're doing in relationships is we're trying to, with trauma anyways, we're trying to change the ending to our original dynamic, the one that got imprinted in us in childhood. We're trying to change that ending to where we won't feel abandoned, right? So we wind up in these unhealthy relationships and we're staying with people even when things are bad. And we're like, that's fine. We're blind to it. We're blind to how unhealthy it is because it's better than being alone. It's better than being not even alone, but better than being left. Being alone, to some of us, is much better than being left. At least if we're alone, we can't be left behind, which means we can't be abandoned. So, to recap, the 7 main things, the 7 signs of abandonment trauma, we have people pleasing. You're trying to impress everyone. You're always trying to meet everybody else's expectations. In relationships, you try harder than everybody else does in the relationship in order to maintain the relationship to prevent others from leaving. You always put other people's needs ahead of yours, even when that causes you stress or pain or even hospitalization in some cases. The second is you struggle with insecurity. People close to you will leave you is always the assumption that someone in your past is probably left, and you're constantly searching for external validation so you can find some kind of security. 3 is it's hard to trust. You don't trust folks. You don't believe their promises. You believe that nobody will be there for you. You have a strong fear of being alone. You tend to get jealous. Number 4 is you're afraid of vulnerability. Number 5 is you're always looking for reasons to leave. Number 6 is you move on far too quickly. Number 7 is you have a string of unhealthy relationships. Okay. So these are 7 signs of abandonment trauma, right? This is specifically about proximal abandonment too. So this is where the thing about proximal abandonment is it gives us all of the sense of abandonment. Like we live with all of the manifestations of the abandonment trauma without a legitimate reason, essentially. And that's why that's why we're using the term proximal abandonment, because it's a legitimate term that gives it legitimacy. But it doesn't feel like a real reason, does it? It just feels like we're here and our parents did their best, whatever. And we can't waste much time on judging them, especially if you're a parent now and you recognize how hard it is and how impossible it is and how much you've screwed up already too. But the bottom line is there is a whole world, a whole universe in most cases underneath all of this fear, this whole universe of negative emotions that we don't want to deal with. And when you are emotionally abandoned, proximally especially, you wind up Well, let's talk about what happens when you are abandoned as a child and this principle that I use for adopt to adapt. What we're adapting to here, this is the first step to adopt to adapt, understanding what that means, is you have to look at what are you adapting to. In this case, with proximal abandonment, what we have to adapt to is having our caregiver in our physical immediate vicinity while they're also not meeting our needs. Right? They're not meeting our emotional and energetic needs, those that need for attunement so we can develop secure attachment. That's the situation that we have to adapt to. So now, let's say that you're a child. The phrase is adopt to adapt. What mindset, what belief could a child come up with? And the simpler the better, because remember, especially if that child is under the age of 7, they're in a hypnotic state. So there's not a lot of analysis happening. They don't have a prefrontal cortex at that age, not one that works in any kind of way. So what kind of story could a child adopt as his reality in order to survive that adaptation, or in order to survive and adapt to the situation of proximal abandonment? Well, if my mother is here and she loves me and she is doing everything right because she is my mother and that's what mothers do, and that's the assumption of a small child, that's a very, very safe and very usual assumption for a small child, and that person is not meeting my needs, then my needs must not be needs. They must be superficial enough that they can be ignored. And so you start to abandon your own needs. And this is where we get into the heart of the problem of abandonment, especially proximal abandonment, because again, with proximal abandonment, we didn't have terrible parents who were beating us and locking us under a sink. We're not dealing with horrible outright abuse in proximal abandonment. We're dealing with this much more subtle version that is insipid because it gets into everything and we feel like we don't have a good enough reason. But now you do. That reason is called proximal abandonment. It is very real and it affects us powerfully. And the biggest problem with all this abandonment, especially proximal abandonment, is it causes us to adopt an entire worldview that is predicated on self-abandonment. It is predicated on me not needing anything. So at this point, life becomes a way to prevent abandonment. Because now you are neurologically set up through proximal abandonment. You are neurologically set up to believe that someone that you care about, somebody important to you, otherwise it wouldn't matter, is going to abandon you at some point or another. And in order to get through your childhood, you had to adopt a lifestyle and a personality predicated on self-abandonment. So, if you have abandoned yourself, that makes other people abandoning you way worse. Because essentially, there's nobody to help you. You're not going to do it because you don't know how to do it because nobody ever taught you. That's part of what happens with proximal abandonment. You weren't taught how to regulate your emotional system. You weren't taught how to regulate your limbic system. You weren't taught how to down-regulate your body after you got ramped up for one reason or another. And so you don't know how to bring yourself back down when something terrible happens, or say when something abandons you. You don't have any skills to regulate yourself when that happens, so then we act out and we get worse. So with proximal abandonment, the thing about these 7 signs is you're not going to, you might be like, I shouldn't have these. I had a perfectly fine childhood. That's kind of a hallmark of proximal abandonment. But the heart of proximal abandonment, since it is like the biggest problem with proximal abandonment, is it eventually leads to self-abandonment. Self-abandonment leads to some very, very pointed behaviors that we can look at to evaluate. Like these other ones are conceptual. The 7 signs of abandonment that we were talking about, people pleasing, insecurities that you find it hard to trust, a fate of vulnerability. These are all very conceptual things that often we can see in ourselves, but they're still conceptualized. So we're going to actually operationalize that a little bit. We're going to take it from just a concept to what does that actually mean. If you didn't see yourself in these first 7, you are almost guaranteed to see yourself in this next list. This next list is all about how self-abandonment plays out. And the thing is, it's almost all subconscious, and that's why it always plays out in compulsive behaviors, almost always. So we're going to look at those compulsive behaviors. We looked at these things as like kind of theoretical groupings, but now we're going to look at actual specific compulsive behaviors that all stem from the self-abandonment that comes from proximal abandonment or regular abandonment, but it's really sneaky when it comes from proximal. So here is the list of compulsive behaviors. Compulsive behavior number 1, compulsive shame. Compulsive shame is really easy to identify because we've talked in the past about guilt versus shame, which is a marvelous podcast. Please, 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 God, go listen to that, or go listen to Brene Brown talk about it, because that's where I got a lot of that information. Brene Brown's, like, her whole thing about separating guilt and shame is so powerful and so dead on. Please, please, please go listen to that podcast, or go, better yet, even go listen to Brene Brown on any of her stuff. And listen to her talk. Like, her writing is good, but her talking is way better, and it says that. But compulsive shame, guilt and shame, the difference between the two is guilt says I did something bad, shame says I am bad. So what does compulsive shame look like? It sounds a little conceptual, but compulsive shame sounds like I am not enough. It sounds like I am not worthy. It sounds like I am not acceptable. It sounds like I am not good enough. It sounds like nothing I do is good enough. Compulsive shame. That is the first sign of abandonment trauma. If you were like, I am not enough, I'm not worthy, this is not acceptable, that compulsive shame is probably stemming directly from self-abandonment. Because if you were enough, you would have had your needs met already, right? If you were enough, you wouldn't have been abandoned to begin with. They would have kept you. Compulsive behavior number 2 is compulsive caretaking. If you take on the needs of others and the desires of others, all to avoid your own pain from your self-abandonment, you have to work on saying no. Compulsive caretaking is something that many of us do, and like everything else on this list, it is adaptive in some situations and maladaptive in others. Caretaking of other people is a wonderful, selfless thing to do, but it's really easy to do for those who are completely selfless, and that the reason you're selfless is not from altruism, but it's because of your own self-abandonment. Because if you actually dealt with your own self, you would have to deal with that backlog of negative emotions that you don't like the sensation of. So you just compulsively put everybody else's needs in front of your own in order to ignore that negative experience in your biology. You just keep it on moving, keep it moving, and keep focusing on other people's stuff. Because you can at least get praised for that. You can at least get told that you're selfless and you're caring and you're wonderful and all that kind of crap. So compulsive caretaking, compulsive shame, compulsive caretaking, and another is compulsive self-reliance. That's pretty self-explanatory. Compulsive self-reliance, we also call that hyper-independence. That's a pretty common trauma response. If you only feel safe when you're alone, or only feel safe when you are the one in charge, that is compulsive self-reliance. If you can't or don't want to ask for help even though you need it, that is compulsive self-reliance. I still struggle with that one. I'm better at some of the other ones, but I still really struggle with compulsive self-reliance because I enjoy my self-reliance to a large degree, but also it can be a problem. I'm getting much better at it, but compulsive self-reliance is compulsive behavior number 3 under compulsive behaviors that stem out of self-abandonment. The next is compulsive numbing. If you are constantly like dealing with your addictions, your distractions, and your binges, you have abandoned yourself most likely. Because again, you're ignoring that buildup, that backlog of negative emotions. And so you're constantly looking for something to change your state, to be able to downregulate you, because trauma in all sorts, abandonment as well, including proximal abandonment, stimulate us in a threat response way. And we have to respond to that threat in our body. The way that we do that is to crank out a bunch of adrenaline, epinephrine, and make us want to go do something about it, right? And some of us go to freeze fawn, and that's slightly different, but it's still like launching the same kind of physiological stress response. And we, because of the proximal abandonment, we're never taught how to downregulate ourselves, because chances are our very well-meaning and loving parents also had no freaking idea how to downregulate themselves, except for maybe with a benzo and a glass of wine at night or whatever. And we didn't do that type of thing in bumfuck Indiana, but I hear, and in movies and TV, that's what a lot of other kids did. My mother never downregulated anything. She just stayed mad and stayed like, I gotta do what I gotta do. So compulsive numbing, if you don't know how to relax, it's because you never got a chance to as a child. So you reach toward external things to help you downregulate. That's why you reach toward whatever you're addicted to. You reach toward whatever compulsive distraction that you have. You reach toward whatever compulsive binging that you have. And I don't just mean binging on drugs or like that sort of thing. I also mean binge watching Netflix for hours, because you're dissociating. Like, it's addiction, distraction, dissociation, binging. All of these things are ways that we reach to something external from ourselves to help us downregulate, because we can't do it ourselves because we've abandoned ourselves. So we have to rely on external things to help us downregulate, because we're constantly living in a threat state. That's what it means to have childhood trauma. That's what it means to have trauma, is that you are more often living in a threat state than most other people are, and that threat state isn't appropriate for that time and place. The next one is compulsive perfectionism. I'm sure you could probably guess this one. This is that very simple adopt to adapt thing. If I'm perfect, then I will be loved and all of my needs will be taken care of. So that's where that all comes from. If I am perfect, then they have to love me. If I am perfect, they have to take care of me. And all of that is, of course, a bullshit lie, but you can't convince a 7-year-old in a theta state of anything different, because that's only the kind of mental gymnastics bullshit that an adult human being could confuse themselves with. That only makes sense to us after years and years and years and years and years, and our ability to stack all kinds of weird things on top of each other and delude ourselves a lot. So compulsive perfectionism, that's a sign of the self-abandonment, because if I'm perfect, then other people can't abandon me. And again, these things are compulsive because we've already abandoned ourselves. So if somebody else does happen to abandon us, there is no fallback. We are supposed to be our fallback. We are supposed to be able to trust ourselves. Like I use that thing of the bird doesn't worry about if the branch that he is on is going to break, because he knows that if it does, he can trust in his own wings. This is true for us, except with our own self-abandonment that stems from our abandonment trauma. We aren't there to be our own safety net, so we have compulsive behaviors that we don't even see. We don't even see these compulsive behaviors, but hopefully now that I'm laying these out one after another, after another, after another, you're starting to see that these things all stem from abandonment. First from being abandoned, and then from abandoning ourselves so we can stay congruously attached with the people who abandoned us, at least in this emotional way, but was there to take care of us in all the other ways. Next is compulsive choosing of unavailable people. This is pretty similar to the compulsively unhealthy relationships. There are lots of ways for relationships to be unhealthy. Only one of which is choosing unavailable people. This is also fairly self-explanatory, because if you choose somebody who doesn't choose you, then you can't be abandoned, because you're like, oh, that would be nice. Oh, that would be nice. Oh, that would be nice. And you keep distracting yourself with the next exciting, nice sounding thing. And then you don't wait around for the emotional repercussions. As we talked about in that last one, you just move from one to the next to avoid those negative feelings. And you just choose another unavailable person that acts as a way for your mind to stay engaged and interested in something that prevents you from having to feel that substrate of the negative feelings in your biology that stem from all the beliefs that you had to adopt in order to adapt to proximal abandonment. The next one is compulsive daydreams and dissociation. If you are compulsively dissociating, daydreaming, you might make a great fiction writer. Like, that's a cool way to use that. But that can become really, really maladaptive, where you're dissociated from your everyday life and from even the impacts of the decisions that you make at work, at home, and you stay dissociated from them because nobody's dying, right? Nobody's dying, so whatever, I can just stay dissociated from this until things get so bad that you can't dissociate anymore, and you go, oh crap, and you use all of that trauma brain stuff to be able to throw together whatever schema you need to throw together to make sure that things don't completely and utterly fall apart. And you do that so quickly and so powerfully that often we make ourselves sick. We make ourselves sick. We have to call into work, or we have to hospitalize ourselves, or we wind up having to talk to a therapist, or we have breakdowns and we don't know why. All of this comes because we're dissociating and daydreaming, again, to avoid the negative feelings that come because we abandoned ourselves because of that experience of proximal or any other type of abandonment. Then we have the compulsive distrust of others. We've already talked about that. Personal, professional, relational, total distrust of others for obvious reasons. They're going to abandon you, so why would you put any trust in this person? Why would you try to figure any extra stuff out? They're just going to leave. And then the last one we're going to talk about is compulsive dysregulation. And this is a feedback loop to me from this compulsive daydream and compulsive dissociation and the compulsive numbing. Like those two, the compulsive dissociation and compulsive numbing, they're pretty darn similar. And the compulsive dysregulation here, that's that loop. We go back and forth between dissociating and numbing long enough that, because we have to lean on these external things to do that for us. So we don't have any kind of internal cue that something needs to be done because we've abandoned our own needs, which means we've abandoned our connection to our soma, which is where our whole energetic reality lives. That's where our emotions begin. They begin as a somatic experience. So if we are compulsively numbing, then we don't get to feel those somatic experience because we're numb or because we're dissociated. And we will do that so long that we're not getting the subtle cues of, hey, maybe it's time to start thinking about work again, or maybe it's time to start thinking about the kids or our goals or our life plans or whatever. And so we wind up waffling back and forth between numbing and dissociation and then extreme dysregulation. We go for like, oh, everything's fine and everything's wonderful because we're dissociated and living in la la land, to, oh shit, everything has gone to shit. And we wind up just waffling back and forth and back and forth. It's really not a fun existence. So that's the compulsive aspect of it. I hope you've seen some. So just to review this again, the compulsive behaviors that stem from self-abandonment are compulsive shame, compulsive caretaking of others, compulsive self-reliance, compulsive numbing, compulsive perfectionism, compulsive choosing of unavailable people, compulsive daydreaming and dissociation, compulsive distrust of others, and compulsive dysregulation. If you wind up doing all those, if you wind up finding yourself often dysregulated, by that I mean there is a physiological experience of uncomfortability in your body that causes your brain to go a little haywire, and you're not thinking very clearly, you're thinking quickly often. There's always a feeling of dissociation somatically, but if we're divorced from our soma, divorced from our body and the way that we often are because of abandonment, it can be hard to deal with. So the first thing that we have to really do if we're going to deal with our proximal abandonment trauma is we have to learn to trust ourselves again. Or for the first time. Not even again. Maybe I should just for the first time. I think for many of us, we have to learn to trust ourselves because we never could before. Because if you can't trust your caretaker completely, and who can, because no caretaker is perfect, then it becomes hard to trust ourselves. Because there's basically at some point during development, our caretakers are essentially gods, and we learn better after that. But that subconscious understanding that we have through that theta state all the way up to the age of 7 is imprinted in our biology. It's imprinted in our DNA, whether it makes sense to us rationally or not. That's the thing, is just because we rationally and cognitively believe or understand something does not mean that the truth of that will carry down into our neurology. So the first thing we have to do is learn to trust ourselves, which means messing up. That means you have to do things wrong, which means that's canceling out the perfectionism thing. And you can't trust yourself if you aren't here. If you're not present in order to take care of yourself, you can't trust yourself. So there goes dissociation. There goes chronic compulsive numbing. There goes the binging. Those are all ways that we leave ourselves. We abandon ourselves over and over again by doing those things, because getting out and numbing ourselves is the closest thing to downregulation that we ever learned. We're going to have to actually teach ourselves how to downregulate. Now, we know, as far as diagnoses, let's talk about diagnoses for a second. And it's just a few, but basically, fuck it. We're just really going to do one. We're going to talk about borderline personality disorder. Borderline personality is something some people know about, some people don't. More people should know about it. It's got a terrible rap, and it's not fun to deal with, because basically borderline personality is somebody who has survived an assload of trauma. That's basically what we know. And we know this from lots and lots of studies that have been done on it now. They're always trying to find genetic components and blah, blah, blah. But the one thing that we know for sure that is the single most impactful on a borderline personality is childhood trauma. We know that they are powerfully, powerfully linked. To me, I call it all chronic stress adaptation, right? That's why I wrote Rethinking Broken. It's chronic stress adaptation, one way or another, whether it's abandonment, whether it's abuse. We find ways to adapt to chronic stress. The way that diagnosis, borderline personality disorder, is best handled was actually created by a doctor who also had borderline personality disorder, and they created a wonderful system that I've done a podcast on previously called dialectical behavioral therapy, or DBT. So, if anybody listening to this, if you see in yourself any of those 7 signs of abandonment trauma, or any of these compulsive behaviors that stem from the self-abandonment, that stem from the abandonment trauma, the first place that you should go to the DBT Skills podcast. Listen to that podcast. Go online, buy yourself a DBT Skills workbook. You can buy them online, empty, and work your way through them. You don't need to know the whole DBT skills setup. You don't need to know the whole thing. They have done a marvelous, marvelous, marvelous job in creating a system where you can just get it. They'll give you the down and dirty. You can do the workbook, and it teaches you, like, oh, that makes sense. I jumped to here. But instead of jumping to there, this is actually the next logical step. And it teaches you how to think through the situations and your own kind of stuff in a very real, practical way to give you skills. And that's what DBT is all about. DBT is all about skills and acronyms. There's a lot of acronyms. But the acronyms are there as a way to remember the skills that are needed or necessary or useful to help us get through regular old interactions with people, knowing that our brains aren't exactly the same because of our trauma. So we're a bit more reactive, a bit more volatile sometimes, a bit more lots of things. And DBT skills are phenomenal skills that will help anybody who's struggling with abandonment trauma, proximal or otherwise, to navigate their life and their relationships, their jobs. Like, it's skills for everything. That's really where we have to start. We have to start with solutions to learn to trust ourselves. And for me, trusting myself as a little bird myself, as a little owl, I don't worry about the branch that's holding me because I know that I can just flap my wings and fly. I don't have to worry about people failing me because I know I can carry that torch. And not always, right? Like I've had to abandon a lot of my own compulsive, like capitalist productivity stuff in order to be able to get to this point. But it's been a very worthwhile trade. It's been a very worthwhile trade to abandon some of my compulsive productivity, which I think is another thing that could be put on this compulsive list. Compulsive productivity is one of the ways that I deal with my abandonment because it helps me to stay proud of myself and be like, see, you don't deserve to feel abandoned, which I know doesn't get to the core of the issue, but it does help in the meantime, and it helps keep me productive, and it makes me do things like this podcast, which make me grow. It stretches me, right? And so I guess let me kind of wrap up, or at least summarize a bit with that. I love mindfulness. I love meditation, but it took me like 5 years of meditating, almost 6 years of meditating, before I realized that I wasn't doing it right for me, because I was trying to throw myself fully into Buddhism and non-attachment and that sort of thing until I realized I actually don't want to be a monk. I really don't. I don't want to live like on a mountaintop and not have any attachments. I love my attachments. I love good food and good wine and good sex, and like I love things done really well. I love incredible somatic and emotional experiences. I love these things that you just don't get to experience as a monk. And as a monk, you're supposed to and I realized I was practicing Buddhism basically like a monk would, because that's who you learn it from, right? I use that as an analogy to talk about healing from trauma, because I don't want to be healed. I'm not sure that that's even a thing. I'm pretty sure it's not a thing, in fact. There are things that we can change about our habits, but we're all just adapted. We're not broken, so we don't really need to heal. We're just adapted. And so what we have to figure out is what we're adapted to, and say, do I still want to be adapted to that? And then change just that. So what I'm trying to say is, you don't need to overhaul everything about your life, and you don't need to heal everything in your life. You don't need to heal everything that you think is wrong with you. And just because you are doing something that is a compulsive behavior that stems from self-abandonment, so long as I feel like you keep it in check to one degree or another, then you're all right. Because number one, we can't change all of these things at one time. In fact, we have to only change one at a time, or the change doesn't stick and it doesn't last. which means we're only able to deal with one adaptation at a time. So my adaptation of being kind of compulsively productive to help me not feel the negative feelings and feel good about myself, there are other things that I'm working on, like not hating myself, that took priority. They took precedence. And I'm glad, because they were more important. So having some compulsive productivity, or having some compulsive numbing for you. Maybe you're a Netflix binge watcher. You don't need to stop that today, along with stopping your perfectionism and stopping your people pleasing and stopping your all of that. That's a trauma response too. Needing to overhaul your life every time you hear something is wrong, or that you do something that is a kind of typical trauma response. If you want to heal every one of your trauma responses, that's a trauma response. Woohoo! I know, it's all circular, it's all stupid, it's all very fucking infuriating, but it's true. So I don't know if this is coming out clear, and I hope to God that it is, because I spend a lot of time on this podcast talking about the things that we do wrong and how we can do them better. But what I want to wrap this up with is, most of us, many of us, we're going to resonate with many of the things that we've talked about today. Many of those 7 signs of abandonment, many of these compulsive behaviors. We're going to identify and resonate with many of these. And please don't try to overhaul all of them all at once. We have to, the only way for a human being to learn, there has to be, there's many factors, obviously, but one of them, a primary one that is like absolutely necessary, is a feeling of safety. So if you feel like you are so broken that you have to fix everything about yourself, you're automatically starting unsafe. You have to realize that most of you works. If you woke up today, most of your biology works. Even the traumatized parts, even your neurology. You can still breathe and swallow and walk and talk and do stuff. Maybe not as well as you want, maybe not all the things that you want, but most of you works. And that's pretty good. So start there. Start with most of you works. If you notice that you used to be much worse at some of these compulsive behaviors or some of these signs, celebrate that. Start with celebrating that. And be like, yeah! And maybe even work on that one a little bit more and ignore the rest. Because we can't fix all of this, right? Like that's the problem with childhood trauma. That's the struggle with it, is it goes so deep, it ripples into a million different fractals and aspects of who we are. It shows up in so many facets of who we are as a person. And we can't fix them all at one time. So be patient with yourself. Be kind with yourself. If you did abandon yourself like I abandoned myself, getting mad at yourself for abandoning yourself is not helpful. So celebrate your wins, man. Celebrate what you've done well. Celebrate that you've kicked ass and you've taken names up to this point. Yeah, you could have done better, but hey, you probably could have done worse. If you're listening to this podcast, you're probably not dead or in jail. And good for you. And if you are, fuck yeah. I don't know how you managed to get this shit in jail, but fuck yeah. Well done. If you are, shoot me an email. I don't know how you're going to do that. But yeah, like really, proximal abandonment is such a sneaky little bitch. Because we have all of these signs of trauma with no real memory of trauma. That's what's so crazy about proximal abandonment, is like we may have other traumas, but we're like, we weren't abandoned. My mom was there. She paid the bills. She sat next to me. She ignored me the whole time, but we don't even usually remember that. I mean, maybe we do, maybe we don't. That's what's so sneaky about proximal abandonment, is it is subtle. It's feeling abandoned while you're in the same room. And how many of us feel that now? How many of us feel utterly alone in a packed room? You ever felt utterly alone in a packed room? Like there's all these people there. None of them pay any attention or give a flying fuck about you. How many times have you felt that? How many times have you avoided a social situation so you could avoid feeling that? Probably quite a few. So that's proximal abandonment. Thank you for listening to another podcast. I hope that you enjoyed this one. I think it's a very important thing that we should be talking about. The problem with abandonment trauma is it causes us to abandon ourselves. The problem with proximal abandonment is it causes us to abandon ourselves, and we don't know that we did it. We don't even know that we were abandoned quite often. That's why it is the modern mental health dilemma, because it's nearly invisible. It shows up in compulsive behaviors, but so many other things also lead to those compulsive behaviors. But in our case, looking at these, the ones that we looked at today, they really all stem from the self-abandonment that we had to adopt. We had to adopt the belief that we needed to abandon our own needs in order to stay safe, in order to stay belonging, in order to stay loved by our caretakers, our parents. So, thank you very much for listening. If you enjoyed this podcast, consider donating, consider joining our Patreon. Mostly, consider leaving a review. Just leave a review. Fuck donating. Fuck joining the Patreon. Just leave a review. Share it with some friends. I love doing these, and I want to do more. So share it with your friends. Let other people know. If you know somebody who kind of fits this bill, send this to them. Let them hear it. Yeah, you listening now who got this from your friend, thank your friend. All right. Thank you all for listening. I love you very much. Keep up the good work. Be kind to yourself. And remember, stay curious and stay uncomfortable.